I am going to go ahead and get started. Good morning again, Geneva Taylor here. I recognize so many names in the chat, and it's great to see all of you joining us today. My co-presenters will introduce themselves when they begin speaking this morning, but these are the folks that you will hear from during this hour together. Today, we're going to go over an overview of our process for monitoring, and we will discuss common trends in all of our popular areas: ESSA, IDA, Perkins V, relief funding, fiscal, and some of our other monitoring areas as well. We'll have a very brief activity, a couple of resources to cover, and conclude this session before our next one begins. The Tennessee Department of Education uses these pillars to ground our work. And just like you, our monitoring work encompasses components of academics to determine students to make sure that they have high access to a high quality education. Student readiness to ensure students have their academic and non-academic needs met and supported. And then educators and the staff that support them have what they need to excel in their fields to support students in the state of Tennessee. So now let's go over our overview together. So in FY24, because we're talking about monitoring trends from last year, in FY24, we had results-based monitoring in 3 different levels. Level 3 is our most at-risk level, and that is an in-person monitoring. Level 2 is virtual with an interview component for our LEA level participants. And level 1 is a virtual document and instrument submission with no interview component. We also have our IEP compliance monitoring process, and our division also oversees CEIS and CCEIS monitoring, as well as focus monitoring, which is when we have a specialized monitoring process that we conduct for any systemic or egregious concerns that we might learn about either through results-based monitoring or through other mechanisms. I also want to take a moment today to recognize all of you. So today we're going to focus on the trends and outcomes of the FY24 monitoring season to help you recognize opportunities for improvement prior to monitoring. But you also have a vast range of experience. So everyone who has joined this webinar, our areas of expertise may be different. It might be day 1 or year 31 for you. I want to make sure that all of you are able to recognize and identify an area that you do well today and an area or 2 that you would like to improve. It's just as important for us to recognize our successes as it is for us to recognize our opportunities for improvement. On behalf of all of us presenting today, also, thank you for the work that you do for students in your districts. We hope throughout the presentation you can identify multiple areas that you do well. We want you to take a moment to celebrate when you recognize a strength. And we hope that you are able to identify maybe a written process that needs to be updated. Develop a template to collect information in a more standardized format, or just document all of the hard work that you do each day. Since we can't see each other today, I ask that you please minimize distractions. Please take notes if you see something that is helpful for you, and identify areas that you could help improve in your LEA. We will answer the common questions in the chat as they come in using the Q&A feature, which is a little bubble that has a question mark in it. We have moderators that are here that are able to answer questions throughout the presentation, and we'll answer any remaining common questions at the end of the presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Terry for ESSA Trends. Terry?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Terry Manning. I'm the ESSA Compliance Manager, and I serve on the Federal Programs and Oversight team. We're going to jump right into the ESSA trends that were identified during FY24 monitoring season. As you can see, these are all of the monitoring components that are included in the ESSA monitoring. I'm going to give you guys a moment to just look through each component. As you can see, the last 5 categories are italicized. So if that may or may not apply to your LEA. But as you can see, the other components, every LEA will participate in those categories. All right, so for Title I Part A, Improving Basic Programs, some of the trends that we identified was maybe LEAs not having an invitation, agenda, and sign-in sheets as proof of meeting to develop that family engagement policy. So perhaps you met, but you did not have sufficient evidence to show that those meetings occurred. Also, we identified that some of those sign-in sheets did not include the roles of participants. As you know, Title I requires us to engage with particular stakeholders. So it's important that we know who those individuals are on the sign-in sheets to ensure that you are meeting those compliance requirements. Also, we identified that there was lack of evidence that the parent compact and family engagement policy was jointly developed. Again, you may have gone through the process to jointly develop the parent compact and the family engagement policy with those identified and required stakeholders. However, there was a lack of evidence to show that those meetings happened jointly. All right, so want to ensure that we have all of our sign-in sheets with all of the required roles and information, all of the details there. All right, so looking at the Title I Part A, students in foster care, we identified lack of policies and procedures for enrolling and serving some of those students in foster care. There was a lack of training to all appropriate school level enrollment personnel and administrators on the requirements of the educational stability for those students in foster care. So once again, want to ensure that we are following all federal guidelines for how we are identifying those students in foster care and immediately enrolling those students. And those processes and policies must be codified, written, so that everyone who's a part of that enrollment process are aware of those federal requirements. All right, so Title I Part C, Education of Migratory Children. We identify a lack of written process to identify, code, and serve those students who are migrant students. There was a lack of written procedures to distribute, collect, and submit the occupational surveys, meaning we want to ensure that you follow a process when you are distributing. If those students do not return the form, what is the school's process to collect that occupational survey? What is your process and who's responsible for submitting those occupational surveys to our identified service provider with the state? What is your process? Always keep that in mind. And if that process is clear and if it's written down. All right, so then we also identified lack of written procedures for completing the individual needs assessment. When should the individual needs assessment be completed? And also who's responsible for completing it? What is the platform in which you are completing that form? And at what time throughout the year are you completing it? Who's responsible? All of those details are important to meet these federal requirements. All right, Title III, Part A, English Language Acquisition. So Title III, we identify quite a few areas of improvement. Some LEAs had no written procedures for how the LEA provides translation and or interpretation to family members. Not ensuring students have ESL service times that are in alignment with assessment scores and not including those transition times between EL classes. meaning you may have a schedule for an EL student and one class is from 8 to 8:30 and then the ESL services start from 8:30 to 9:30. There's no transition time in between those classes, so it can indicate, or it does indicate, that the student is not receiving the full amount of service time. So you want to ensure that you have transition times between each class, even if it's only 3 minutes. There has to be a transition time. We also identified that ILP templates did not include all of the requirements. Ensure that you are looking at those templates, that you're looking at it, that those templates include all of the required components before you complete them, before you implement those ILPs. Parent notification templates not including all of the requirements. The same with your EL reclassification procedure, ensuring that it's clearly written how and when an EL student will be reclassified. There must be a process. What does that process include? What data is included? What parent notifications are included in that reclassification process? Which team members come together to make that decision regarding reclassification of ELs? All of those requirements should be included in your procedures. Then we have your ESL staff training that must require all components. If you are the ESL director, I am going to strongly encourage that you attend those Title III monthly office hours. There is a wealth of information presented during those meetings, during those sessions. If you're not familiar with the ESL office hours or those Title III office hours, please access ePlan, and all of that information is on the front page, the home page of ePlan. All right, so looking at Title III immigrant students, there was a lack of written procedures outlining the process, again, to identify, code, and serve those students who are immigrant. Being very clear about what an immigrant student is, defining that, have a process, a written process in place that anyone can pick up and look at to say, okay, this student identifies as immigrant, here are the next steps. Right, moving to the next one. All right, looking at your Title IX Part A, Education for Homeless Children and Youth. We want to ensure that all of our educational rights of homeless children and youth posters have up-to-date contact information. You want to check those every single school year and throughout the school year. As you know, we have individuals who are transitioning out of those roles. You want to ensure that these posters are updated with the appropriate contact person. You want to ensure that you have an LEA level dispute resolution process in place, one that outlines very clearly that if you deny the enrollment or transportation or any service provided to a student identified as homeless, that there is a process, a very clear process that must be followed. And that process is clear to the parent and is also clear to the individuals who are serving those students in the school. So again, making sure that all of your processes are clear and written down for anyone to use, including parents and staff. It's easy to follow. All right, so we also identified that there is a lack of training to all appropriate school level enrollment personnel and administrators on the requirements of identifying and enrolling students experiencing homelessness. Again, making it very clear that when students are identified as homeless, that there are very clear next steps as to what needs to happen. All right, so your staff knows, enrollment staff, counselors, whoever's part of that process, that they are very clear on if that student is identified as homeless, we have a next step for that student. We immediately enroll that student. We immediately refer that student to the counselor for a needs assessment, whatever that process is, making sure that it's clear and it's written down. All right, so what are some action steps that we can take to correct the trend in non-compliance? So for example, if your issue is that the LEA indicated that it uses students or family members to provide translation and interpretation services, it is important for you to know and for you to have this information written down that translation and interpretation are requirements under Title I, Part A. Schools must provide translation and interpretation from appropriate and competent individuals and may not rely on or ask students, siblings, friends, or untrained school staff to translate or interpret for parents. That is very important for you to know and for you to have that reflected in your policies and your processes. The LEA must ensure it has a written procedure for translation and interpretation for English learner families and must ensure all school leaders and applicable staff are aware of the procedure, meaning anyone in that school building who serves these students and their families, it should be extremely clear on the procedure for providing these services, the translation and the interpretation services, meaning we're not just figuring it out along the way. If I have a student or a family member who needs interpretation services, I can't just figure out during that time, who do I contact? When do I contact them? If I'm going to grab a student, it should be very clear that we have a written procedure that if the parent or student requires translation or interpretation services, this is step one, this is step two. We contact this person, we use this service to provide those services. Okay, so other ways or other action steps to correct the trending of non-compliance, ensure that you develop a sign-in and agenda template to ensure that those needed details are captured. The meeting title, the date, the start and end times, signature, and please include the roles of all participants, because again, we have to be able to identify that you've engaged with the appropriate stakeholders. You also want to save all your training documentation and merge together in a PDF file. Ensure that your processes followed are in written procedures. Right, so that's the key to all of this, having written procedures and ensuring that we are following what is written down. Right? You want to check your ESL service times for alignment with their assessment scores. You want to check all ESL schedules for transition times between classes. You want to correct out of date or incomplete contact information on educational rights of homeless children in your youth posters. Also, complete the LEA level dispute resolution process and ensure alignment with the state level dispute resolution process. This is regarding your McKinney-Vento students, the dispute resolution process. Ensure that when you're writing that process that you identify who is responsible. All those details are required. Who does the parent contact if they have a dispute resolution that they need to follow? Who do they contact? What is the contact method? What is the timeline? When should they expect to hear back from that person or a decision is made? All of those components are required in your dispute resolution process. Right? Gonna hand it back off to G. Oh,
Thank you, Terry. So let's now discuss some IDEA trends from results-based monitoring for FY24. Before I get started, I want to make sure that everyone is able to type in the Q&A area. It is a couple of little chat bubbles with a question mark in it. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to post there, and folks that are not speaking at that time will address your questions. If we have remaining questions at the end of the section of the presentation, the presenter will also reply to you there too. So with that, in FY24, our IDEA section of our results-based monitoring instrument received a little bit of an overhaul thanks to our Oversight team. And we aligned our page names with the sections of the federal law, and then carved out an area for our state level requirements that don't fit nice and neat within the federal law. And of course, have some additional pages that are applicable for certain LEAs. So IDA Part B preschool, our adult students detained in jails, equitable services, charter, alt ed, and virtual school oversight apply only when applicable to our LEAs. So in our first page, which is general state eligibility and LEA eligibility, the most common issue that we found was inadequate evidence that the LEA had written procedures for implementation of the provision of special education and related services. Specifically, the most common areas that we found here were with free and appropriate public education, FAPE, child find processes, private school services, goals for performance of children with disabilities through school improvement planning, and MOE procedures were the most frequently mentioned written procedures that were either lacking detail or did not exist within an LEA. You're going to notice a common theme here for evaluations, eligibility determinations, IEPs, and educational placements. Again, a lack of written procedures were listed here, or did not have evidence that they met all of the requirements. So here, the most common ones that were mentioned were evaluation and reevaluation, as well as determination of eligibility procedures. So it's not enough for you to be able to verbally walk through those items. We need to make sure that your procedure is written down. And when our team is discussing that procedure with you, that it matches with what is written down. We also very frequently mentioned IEP procedures. Also, students with disabilities, inclusion in state and district-wide assessments, making sure that appropriate accommodations, modifications, and reporting of assessment data was included in that procedure is very important. And then, of course, for all of these areas that we're mentioning with a lack of written procedures, we want to make sure that you have associated documentation that proves to us that you trained your school level administrators, your special education teachers, and any other appropriate staff within the district. So our next area is procedural safeguards, monitoring enforcement, confidentiality, and program info. Here, again, a very similar trend, but specific to discipline procedures not being outlined in accordance with the federal law regarding suspension and expulsion. Moving over to IDEA state level requirements, we saw a lack of procedures that aligned with that state board rule that mentions isolation and restraint. Specifically, that rule was updated a little over a year ago into 2 years ago now. And specifically, timelines need to be included, your time constraints, your reporting incidents, when do you report up to the department, and what process do you use? Who is allowed to create those reports? Who is the point of contact responsible for verifying that the data in TN Pulse is true, accurate, and correct on behalf of your LEA, and how frequently is that verified? So mentioning all of those things in your procedures will make it much more likely to be compliant. Also in the state level requirements area, a second very common trend is no documentation of a certified gifted teacher. So there are employability standards that are mentioned in our state board rules. And that requires appropriate certification or a plan of consultation that is in place with a gifted teacher that works outside of the LEA. So an LEA, a district, can have either documentation. You do not have to have both, but one of the two must be in place. We know that we have gifted students throughout the entire state of Tennessee, in every corner, in all of our large urbans to our very smallest districts. So please make sure that if this does not resonate with you, if you cannot put your hands on either a plan of consultation or cannot verify that your teachers are certified to serve as a gifted teacher, please check into that and make sure that you're able to be compliant in this area. Okay, in IDA Part B preschool, it's very similar to gifted. There's a lack of evidence that teachers have the appropriate endorsement to cover that work. In IDA, there just aren't as many options for teachers to come in and teach in an area outside of their endorsement area. It's just not something that the state of Tennessee allows. So making sure that when you're hiring your educators, that they are coming in with the appropriate endorsements, making sure that you are recruiting folks that are willing to add on that endorsement and not having them cover those classes until they have the appropriate endorsement in T and Compass is the way to go here. We also want to make sure that there is evidence that your LEA has provided required oversight. So have your educators followed all of the procedures that are required in the federal law. And so that can come from training and what your process is to oversee that work, how often you are checking in on their IEPs, their processes, their accommodations and modifications, and those sorts of things. So how can we correct these non-compliant items? If you've recognized any of these as something that you need to improve upon within your LEA, you can develop and or update written procedures. You can always phone a friend in your particular area and say, I would really love to see your isolation and restraint policy or whatever policy it might be that you feel like you do not have in your particular LEA. But please make sure that you customize whatever it is that you review before you adopt it. So if I'm in ABC County and I'm borrowing from XYZ County, I need to make sure that whatever is in that policy process procedure is accurate in XYZ County. So some common written procedures, again, are evaluation, reevaluation, and determination of eligibility procedures, IEP procedures, they inclusion in state and district-wide assessment. That also would include your accommodations, modifications, and reporting of that data. And then, of course, FAPE, Child Find, private school services, your goals for performance, and your MOE procedure. So all of those were common items that we found throughout monitoring this section of IDEA. We also want to make sure that our educators have proper endorsements to teach the students that are in their classrooms. This includes meeting the employability standards that are in that state board rule that's listed here on your screen right now, or that you have a plan of consultation in place. So you have a signed agreement with another certified gifted teacher outside of the LEA that can provide consultation services to the teacher of record for those gifted students. And then we want to make sure that you have evidence of your preschool students with disabilities being served by a teacher with the appropriate endorsement as well. And you'll see that state board rule listed here as well for your convenience to be able to look that up later. Next, let's turn our attention to students with disabilities detained in jails. Many of our LEAs have jails within their geographic boundaries, although some do not. So it's very important when you are discussing this with your monitoring team that you are sure of where the jail is located. Is it within your geographic boundaries of your district, or is it in the city but you're a county, or is it in a different special school district within your county? So making sure that you know the answers to those questions and who's responsible for providing services to those adult detainees with disabilities is very, very important. You need to document collaboration, such as a memorandum of understanding with your jail or detention center within the LEA geographic boundaries. In that MOU, you want to include a written process to serve students and documentation that students receive services. How often, who's responsible, what method of delivery will be used. The more that you can address in that MOU, it makes it more clear with the point of contact at the jail or detention center, when to reach out, when to notify you that a student is there that may be eligible to receive services, when they begin, and what that will include. So that concludes the IDEA section. I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Gately, to discuss Perkins trends.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Gately. I'm the Perkins Compliance Manager with Federal Programs and Oversight. And I'm going to talk through first Perkins trends and then fiscal trends for my Perkins and fiscal friends. So we are going to start with Perkins. So looking at the different sections we have here, we have Perkins 5 cross-cutting, effective educators, students with disabilities, and then students in special populations, all of those students in those groups other than students with disabilities. All right, so for this first section, Perkins 5 cross-cutting, this section, we had fewer findings for this year than in the past, but we are still seeing the trend of this being an issue. For the comprehensive local needs assessment, LEAs are required every 2 years to complete this. We just finished up a cycle of addressing the comprehensive local needs assessment. Most LEAs did that by region. So being able to produce documentation that each required stakeholder group was consulted is important here. We know that many, again, did that as a region. So just being able to keep up with that documentation, show that meaningful consultation happened with all of those different stakeholder groups, or there was an attempt to reach out to all required stakeholder groups is the requirement here, and would help to alleviate any findings of non-compliance. All right, so for effective educators, for this section, this is going to deal with professional development. So all of our programs across the state and CTE are required to provide professional development. There's a 5% minimum that has to be put towards professional development in your Perkins local application. And in Perkins 5, they define what professional development is. So that's defined as providing skills to ensure student success in CTE that are sustained, which means they can't be standalone PD events. They can't be a one-day or short-term type workshops. They have to be sustained, intensive, collaborative, job-embedded, data-driven, and classroom-focused, and to the extent practicable, evidence-based. So a lot of LEAs that we asked for evidence of this, they were lacking evidence, such as agendas, topics that were discussed, proof that CTE educators received the professional development, and those types of things. So this can be internal or external. It could be PD that's offered by the LEA or PD that CTE educators attend. But we know that a lot of times those things are not, if a CTE teacher attends professional development, it may not be something that they have that is sustained or ongoing. So that's something to keep in mind there. Okay, so students with disabilities. In this section, we're still seeing the trend that LEAs are not able to show evidence that specific career guidance and academic counseling for students with disabilities was taking place throughout their secondary career. So that means all throughout high school, we should be able to show how we are offering specific career guidance and academic counseling to students with disabilities. So when we ensure that students with disabilities are receiving those academic counseling and career guidance throughout their secondary careers, it's going to aid in placing that student in their chosen career field, something that they could persist in, hopefully, and then provide a living to themselves and a family if they choose so later on down the road. These could be life-changing decisions that are made for these students. So it's important to make sure that this is happening, whether that's through school counselors, through work that is being done in the CTE classroom with CTE teachers. We know that career exploration happens in all of our CTE courses, so that could be included in this. So just making sure that there are multiple touch points with those students that have disabilities to make sure that those students are connected to those programs of study. They are in the appropriate programs of study, and that we are getting them all the opportunities that we can. So there has to be a description of an organized system of career guidance and academic counseling for students with disabilities in this section. Okay. Students in special populations groups. So we have 9 subcategories, including students with disabilities. This is for all of our other subcategories of students. So we're still seeing that there are some special populations groups that are not being identified, or there's not a procedure really to identify those students, so a mechanism to identify them in the LEA. And we're also not seeing data being collected. Obviously, if those students are not being identified, there's no way to really collect data and analyze that for those students. So again, being able to identify these students is going to allow us to provide any additional resources to customize any kind of career guidance and academic counseling for these students to make sure that we're getting them into the appropriate programs of study that they relate to and that could offer them a meaningful career choice after secondary. All right, so steps to correct the training non-compliance issues here would be training. So making sure that you're including proof of attendance, agendas, any training materials that came along with the PD. That's going to be important. Data collection, so methods of data collection, those discussions that are being had, who's in those meetings, how often do they happen, what are the decisions that were made based on that data. It's important in all of our federal programs areas, especially Perkins, to use data to drive the program study we're offering, the EPSOs that we have. We have a lot of data points with CTE, so making sure that we're using those to make those decisions and guide our programs and how we're spending our funds is really important. And then the last is proof of supporting vulnerable subgroups in CTE. So all of those special population subgroups would be important to include there. So for size, scope, and quality indicators, we do collect this in a separate instrument, but for this year, we are going to be writing results for this. So I want to make that clear. There will be findings of noncompliance written for this. There will be recommendations, and there will be the whole scope of results written for this. So for SSQI portfolios not meeting compliance in Tennessee State Perkins V plan, as laid out in the Tennessee State plan. So for level 3, we look at 25% of the programs at each participating school. We're going to review those. For level 2, only the 2 programs of study identified as the CTE high quality programs of study for that LEA are going to be looked at. And if any of those, whether it's level 3 or level 2, if greater than 75% of those portfolios reviewed are non-compliant, there's going to be a finding of noncompliance written for those. We will again give feedback on how to improve those processes or those portfolios so that you're not left in the dark and you will know exactly what needs to be addressed. So Perkins 5 does outline the requirements for the uses of funds, states that only programs that are sufficient size, scope, and quality should have funding spent on those programs. And one of the ways, as I had mentioned before, are those size, scope, and quality indicators to show that your programs are quality programs. All right, so fiscal trends. Starting with fiscal trends, we're going to look at the different categories here: general fiscal, travel, equipment, procurement and contracts, ESSA use of funds, IDEA use of funds, Perkins 5 use of funds, and then the ESSER use of funds as well. So starting with general fiscal requirements, this one deals with the excess carryover amounts. And if you stick around for our next session, I'm going to talk through this when we look at the risk analysis categories. But we have certain federal programs where if excess carryover greater than 50% is becomes a trend, we see that there is risk involved in that. So if there are excess carryover amounts, though, the current allocations are not benefiting the current students, the students that generated those funds. So if excess carryover is determined during the monitoring that we hold, an LEA must provide a spend down plan to expend the funds that are carried over. For compensation, for this one, the LEA has to have written procedures regarding time and effort. So with this one, we have seen semi-annual certifications and then those PARs, the personnel activity reports. If this is an issue, they might not be gathered, the evidence might not be there for those. Remember that semi-annual certifications are for folks that are 100% funded by one grant or activity, and you'll need to keep a PAR for anyone who is funded with more than one funding source. Now that includes those that are paid for with or funded through federal and local funds, and you have to show the time, how the time is split between the two. So if they were 80% federal and 20% local funds, you would still include the 20% of the local funds on that PAR. Okay, so for travel, documentation provided during the process here clearly has to outline the policies and procedures for travel. This includes the board policy and procedures that should include mileage or expense rates. What we often see is the policies and procedures might not match the board policy. So ensuring that everything gels together and everything, if the board policy states that the state rate is what is reimbursed, then the policies and procedures and other documentation shouldn't state a specific amount, because we know that those change from year to year. Equipment, so some components required to be collected and documented as part of the equipment were missing in a lot of the inventories that we looked at that were non-compliant. So policies and procedures for equipment inventory management have to be provided, and all information must be provided on the inventory listing as required in 2 CFR. This does include the FAIN, the Federal Award Identification Number. That will be a finding of non-compliance if that is not included for the FY25 monitoring cycle. So you can find those on your grant award notification if you are not sure where to look for those. All right, so procurement and contracts. So approval from the federal program supervisor is what's need to be seen here. We are seeing some travel reimbursements and other requests to spend funds that are not approved by the federal program supervisor prior to the money being spent, or not at all. So ensuring that that's happened is going to be really important. Yes, federal program supervisors includes ESSA, IDA, ESSER, and CTE directors. If you oversee a federal program, you are a federal program supervisor. All right, ESSA and IDA use of funds. So monitoring teams were not able to match expenditures at some points with any plan with the submitted reimbursement request documentation. A lot of this can be alleviated by using those templates in the monitoring instrument. Those are provided if you pull up. So let's say for the ESSA and IDA use of funds, you go into those pages in the documentation area, you'll see a template that you can download. And please include all of the information for every category they are listed. But according to CFR, we have to adequately document and make sure all of those align. So for Perkins V use of funds, often what we saw was either the equipment was not able to be located, whether it was lost, stolen, somebody took it home, whatever the case might be. Those items have to be where they are stated. They have to be, or they are on the equipment inventory. They should not be in other locations. And if something does become lost or stolen, you need to follow your disposition policies and guidelines. And a lot of times the equipment was incorrectly tagged. So there might be a tag or no tag on there, but there might be a number that just does not match what the inventory states. So clearly making sure that all of those things are happening and that inventory is being done at least once every year is important. So the ESSER use of funds, the LEA did not provide evidence of contracts and bids using ESSER funds. So ensuring that your contracts and bids processes that are followed for the LEA, you should have board policy and processes that are already approved by your board. Those have to be followed. And for those federal projects that involved any kind of capital expenditures, the Davis-Bacon Act has to be followed and kept up with. You can find all the particulars on that if you can just Google Davis-Bacon Act. But really that is to ensure that all of your folks, your contractors, are paying their staff the correct wage. They're not underpaying them, and that they are keeping up with the time and effort of their folks on a weekly basis. All right, so the last category here is supplement, not supplant. So LEAs in this area cannot demonstrate that state and local funds were distributed to schools equitably, whether the schools received the Title I Part A funding or not. So LEAs have to have a written methodology for how they show that these schools are receiving funds equitably. Again, whether they receive the Title I Part A funding or not, they have to have a method to determine SNS testing here. Okay. So the summary for the fiscal monitoring components here, I will say first of all is document, right? So sufficiently and clearly stating that the policies and procedures and all of the associated documentation has to align. If there is a specific amount for reimbursement in one area, it has to have that in all documents. So remember, let's say somebody's reimbursing 47 cents a mile on your board policy, all of your other documentation has to state that. So policies and procedures must be followed. Update to align with the current practices as appropriate, and then set time in your calendar to review at least annually. We know that documents change periodically, so it's or policies, so it's important to create all of our documents to support those and make sure they're revised. Proper approval by the program or project directors for expenditures. Cash management policies have to be updated. Sufficient documentation for expenditures have to be in place, and then equipment management is also a requirement. All right, I'll now turn it over to my friend Laura Dunn.
Good morning. I am Laura Dunn. I am the IDEA Compliance Manager, and I will be covering some IEP monitoring trends. Remember, this is from last year, FY24. Just want to remind everyone that all students will have either an initial or reevaluation section. All students will have IEP, and if applicable, students will have transition or secondary transition. Next slide, please. Some monitoring trends that we saw, adverse impacts, making sure that the adverse impact statement describes specifically how the student's disability affects participation and progress in the general curriculum. And we'll look at that closer in just a second. Measurable annual goals, they don't contain complete measurement criteria. And again, we'll look at that. One thing we did see and continue to see, there is a component of the platform that allows LEAs to self-flag or self-identify non-compliance. And we found that the LEAs with the highest percentage of overall non-compliance were also the least likely to be able to self-identify in their own LEA. Adverse impact, some things to consider. It should contain observable actions or characteristics, explain or show how the student is specifically affected by the disability in the general education setting. It is their foundation for present levels. So if a student has a disability and OHI, the adverse impact statement should relate to OHI. You will have present levels that relate to OHI, and you will have measurable annual goals that relate to OHI. So everything should align. The adverse impact statement is a description of the student's disability within the context of the curriculum and setting. It is a description of the student who has been made eligible in a specific disability category. So if a student is has a disability, is documented as a reading disability, the adverse impact statement should address that disability. It should not address something else. Adverse impact statements, it should not contain supports, accommodations, modifications. It should not compare students to their peers. It would not make it non-compliant. However, it is not needed. An example of an adverse impact statement, the student's advanced skills cause them to become disengaged during instruction and results in distraction of others, verbal outburst, and refusal to participate. This is compliant. It tells what the disability category is. It also tells specifically what I would observe or what the student is demonstrating. The second one, students' deficient areas of language and social emotional behavior impact their access to and participation in the general education curriculum compared to their peers. Deficiencies will be supported in the IEP. This one, on the other hand, is non-compliant. The reason it is non-compliant, it tells me it impacts their access, but it does not tell me how their access is impacted. For measurable annual goals, they need to address each area identified as exceptional in the present levels. So, for example, if it is a behavior, they need a behavior goal. If it is reading, they need a reading goal. They need to contain the criteria for mastery, the method of evaluation. They also need to include a statement of special education related services, supplementary aids. So what are you providing to enable the child to advance toward meeting that annual goal? Please note, alternate assessment, it requires measurable goals and objectives. Some things to consider. Make sure your IEP goals are individualized for each student. We do see occasionally every student will have the same reading goal, or every student will have the same behavior goal. That does not necessarily make it non-compliant, but it is a red flag, and that would be a cause for us to look a little bit deeper. Students who participate in assessment, of course, also have to have objectives along with goals. How do they relate to student outcomes? Measurable annual goals provide consistent measurable criteria by which progress in exceptional areas may be assessed. It communicates real-time progress to parents, teachers, service providers, and students. It allows us real-time progress for everyone to view. It ensures consistent optimal alignment between services, supports, and student performance. So it aligns with everything. Some additional areas to consider when you're looking at an IEP is your accommodations. Make sure your classroom accommodations align with testing or assessment accommodations. Least restrictive environment. Make sure that your times, your locations, and your descriptors align. Make sure your settings align with the type of service it is. Extended school year. It must contain data if you determine that ESY is needed. If you determine it is not needed, data is not needed. And then prior written notice, make sure that your prior written notice contain the date of the meeting and the date sent to parent, along with a descriptor of what occurred during the meeting. Finally, on reevaluation, make sure that your reevaluation documentation contains one general education and one special education observation form. Make sure that team decision aligns with the parental consent signature, and make sure that your documentation contains the data that was shared with the team for both summative and formative assessment. And I will pass it back over to my colleague, Geneva Taylor.
Thank you, Laura. So I do know that we're running a little bit short on time, so I am going to speed our way through a few of our other monitoring components. For our main area called cross-cutting, the most common thing that we see is that an LEA requires a social security number or requires a birth certificate. To correct that issue, you can make those listed as optional and have other documents listed that you would accept instead, and a note that states that you can help them retrieve these items if they're having difficulty locating them. Also in cross-cutting, a 5-year strategic plan, it needs to be current when we are on site. So if your 5-year strategic plan ended in 2023, that would be non-compliant. It also needs to be reviewed and revised at least every 2 years. For relief funding, we need to make sure that our costs are adequately documented for reimbursement. So much like what Michael said, making sure our evidence of expenditures match to the penny. And we want to make sure that our processes are refined and they are actually what we follow, and that it's benefiting the students that generated the funds. So really quickly, I'm going to ask that all of you in our last couple of minutes together recognize your own work. You do hard work to benefit our Tennessee students, so thank you again for that. Do you have the documentation we've discussed today to prove that you do all of that work? So again, we just ask that you identify an area that resonated with you, be it a lack of procedures, lack of training, barriers to enrollment, or lack of meeting documentation. I hope that all of you walk away from this presentation with at least one item or one action step that can help you either remedy a weakness or continue to strengthen your processes within your school district. So for some resources, you can pull your monitoring results from FY23 or 24. You can do that in ePlan. You can also review our risk analysis data from FY24. The FY25 guide will be coming out very soon. And I also want to mention that we'll have FPO monitoring office hours. We will cover those at the conclusion of each of our sessions. Announcements and invitations will be coming out soon as well. And there you'll be able to turn on your camera and unmute yourself. So in summary, we ask that you review your written policies and procedures. Make sure that you plan to involve your applicable team members. No one can do all of this work alone. So as I like to say, invite your friends, your enemies, and your frenemies to help you write those policies, processes, and procedures, or at least trade and read a colleague's procedure while they read yours to make sure that it aligns. I would be remiss if I did not show you our fraud, waste, or abuse slide. If you feel like we were fraudulent, wasteful, or abusive, you can contact our comptroller. And lastly, I ask that you please complete an evaluation. I will leave this on the screen for just a minute or so, and then we will move into our next presentation, which is about the risk analysis. So if you do not want to hear all about our risk analysis, feel free to mute us and go on about your business for about an hour or so. Some folks have mentioned that the Q&A is not working for them. We have enabled chat. If you are some of the folks that the Q&A is not working. Also have noticed that some users are having an issue if they log out and log back in more than 3 times. We apologize for that. This is our first time using this webinar feature. So we are all learning together and appreciate your patience.